Okay, so here I am in Sydney. That's the famous Sydney Opera House there. I'm sure just about all of you knew that. And what I wanted to talk to you about was aperture. That's the amount of light that comes through the lens so you can control your exposure. And there are three things that really control it. It's the aperture, shutter speed, and the ISO, all combined. But the aperture does a bit more than just control the exposure. So the aperture is relevant on all sorts of cameras, whether it be a DSLR like this, compact camera, bridge camera, they all need to have a particular aperture, and you can change that aperture. And it's measured in f-stops. So an f-stop that is a low number, say 2.8 or 4, is when the lens is pretty much wide open, letting in as much light as possible. A high number is not allowing a lot of light in, and it's a very small hole. And you can see on this old camera that I've got that as I change it from f6.3 up to 32, you'll see it closes down, so there's not a lot of light coming through. Now it has two effects this. One, it's controlling the exposure, but it's also controlling the depth of field. And the depth of field is the amount of information that's actually in focus. So if I was to take this here, for example, this little life buoy here, this little buoyancy device, what will actually happen is if I take a photograph of that, potentially the Opera House is not going to be in focus. And this is down to the depth of field. If you've got a small number, so the lens is wide open, it has a very shallow depth of field. That means not a lot is in focus. So actually, if I take my camera here, it's on aperture priority, which is AV, and I can control it just by moving this wheel here. Now I'm just going to set this to f2.8 and take a photo of that, and you'll see that the Opera House is out of focus. However, if I increase it to something like f22, focus on the same thing, the shutter speed has changed, take the picture, and now the Opera House is more in focus than before. If I chose something in between, well, that's down to you how much you may or may not want in and out of focus. So the other way around I could do this is actually to focus on the Opera House, keep it at f22 and do that, and then if I change it back to f2.8, again focused on the Opera House and click, you'll see that this over here is in a different focus as well. So maybe a bit too close. I wouldn't get both of them perfectly in focus in this instance, but you can see that adjusting the aperture allows you to change the depth of field and therefore have different things in focus. So one of the things you might want to do is if you've got someone here like myself and you want to take a photograph of me and emphasize me and focus on me so that I am the important thing in the photograph, you may want the background a little bit out of focus, and that's where the depth of field can come in and help you control that. So that's why adjusting the aperture is so important. So a small f number, f-stop, such as 2.8, means that not very much is in focus, which could be great. And you can now look at photographs and see just how much is in and out of focus. So a high number means it's closed the lens down, a bit like when you squint like this sometimes, when you're trying to get more in focus, that's what it's actually doing on the camera as well. So this lens has got an f2.8. That's considered a fast lens. We talk about the speed of the lens. So something that is maybe a minimum of f1.8, f2.8 will be considered a fast lens. If you've got something that is 4 or 5.6 as its minimum, won't be considered a fast lens. Now the other thing that's important to look for when you're looking for a lens and you're talking about f-stops is that as you zoom in, you will find that the f-stop will have a different minimum. So this particular lens is f2.8 all the way through the range. Now this is another thing about depth of field, is that a longer lens, a telephoto, one that zooms in a lot, has a narrower depth of field. So wide angle, you don't get quite the same effect as if you've got a telephoto. So wide angle has just generally, even at f2.8, a wide depth of field. But if you've got a telephoto, you'll notice it's even more narrow, which means you've got to be even more careful with your focusing. So that's what the aperture is all about. It's basically about controlling the exposure, but also about controlling the depth of field. So it does help you focus on something and making it stand out. So if you've got everything in focus, maybe it's not highlighting the subject that you really want. If it's slightly out of focus, you could still see, for example, if it was on me, I'm at the Opera House, but the Opera House isn't sharp, so I'm the center of the attention there. Have a look at someone like Ansel Adams, the great American photographer. He used to shoot a lot of stuff at f64. everything's in focus. They're great photos, so go and check those out. You can just Google him. Thanks for watching. Come back and I will talk to you more about things like shutter speed and ISO.